In this episode of Derp Star, I'll be fixing the collision layers and gravity area. The main problem is the gravity beam affects the player even when it's deactivated, which is obviously not the intention. I think it's because they changed the way gravity affects the collision layer and mask, but I've been meaning to do this anyway, so it's not a problem. First, I'll go to the 2D collision layers under project settings, 2D physics under layer names, and I'll make a layer for the player, enemies, items, projectiles, and energy shields. The Derp star is already on the player collision layer, which is layer 1, and I have the mask enabled as well, so it will bounce off any allies. And I'll enable the second layer mask, which is the enemies, so it'll bounce off of the bumpers as well. Then I'll open up the bumper ship base scene and set the layer to 2, which is enemy, and set the mask to 1 and 2, so it'll bounce off the player and the other bumpers. Then I'll set the player gravity beam to only mask with collision layer 2, so it only affects the enemies and not the player. And I'll do the same for the energy laser. So now you can see that the gravity beam only affects the bumpers and no longer affects the player. Now I'll open up the item base scene and set the collision layer to 3, which is the items. Now it has to be a rigid body so that the gravity beam and black hole gravity can affect the item and pull it in. If it's just an area, it won't be affected by physics. So it has to be a rigid body. But I don't want it to collide with the other items or the bumpers or any allied ships, so I don't have it set to mask with anything. And I'll enable the third collision mask on the gravity beam so it can pick up the items. Now I do want the Derp star to be able to interact with the items so it can pick them up. But if you just enable the third collision mask, it will send the Derp star flying from the impact when it gets the points. So I'll add a ore chunk to demonstrate. And as you can see, the impact sends you flying, which I don't want. So instead of colliding with the items, I added an area 2D to the item body and set the collision mask to layer 1. Then in the script, when the area 2D enters the player body, call the onPickup function, which is overwritten by the individual item scenes. And now when you pick up an item, it doesn't affect your trajectory. Next, I'll set the player energy shield to the 5th collision layer, and this doesn't need to collide with anything else. So the energy shield is a kinematic body which is slightly larger than the Derp star, so it can deflect incoming projectiles. Now I'll add the bumper ship laser bullet to the projectile layer, and I don't actually want it to collide with the other projectiles, but I do want it to collide with the energy shield, the enemies, and the player, obviously not the items either. And I'll do the same for the Olympus Cloud lightning bolt. I'll probably refactor these to share a parent scene in the future. I also want the thrusters to deal damage to the bumpers, so I'll set the flame area to affect both the enemies and the player, and there's a faction check in deal damage, so it only damages the enemies. And I'll remove everything but the shooting star from the derp space dimension to demonstrate. So now you can see that the lasers deal damage to the player, but when you put up the energy shield, they bounce off instead. I do need to fix the shooting star shader. As you can see, it is not working correctly. Now the collision shapes are working, but I'm having an issue with the gravity beam where the bumpers are permanently affected. So they orbit around the player and slingshot back into you until they break. I was having some issues isolating the problem, so I made a new project for testing. In the new project, I'll make a new 2D scene and save it as the main scene. Then I'll add a new rigid body 2D and leave the physics properties at default. Then I'll add the icon as the image, reset the position, and add a collision shape 2D to get rid of the warning. I'll set the shape to a new rectangle and set the size to 128 by 128. Then I can move the body over, and you can see it falls due to gravity, but there shouldn't actually be gravity in space. So I'll open up the physics 2D and set the default gravity to 0 and the gravity vector to 0, 0. So now the body stays in place. Now I'll add an area 2D, rename it to gravity area, set the gravity space override to combine, enable point, and set the point center to 0, 0. Then I'll add a collision shape 2D as a child, set the shape to a circle, and set the radius to 200. And I'll move the gravity area to the middle of the screen. Now I'll attach a new script to the main node. On input, if the event is a mouse event motion, set the global position of the gravity area equal to get global mouse position. And I'll enable visible collision shapes under debug. So now the area follows the mouse movement. However, it doesn't seem to be affecting the body. So the problem is that the rigid body has can sleep enabled by default. So I'll disable that. And now you can see that the icon is affected by the gravity area. If you move the area slowly over the icon and then away, the icon moves in the direction it was traveling, as you would expect. However, if you move the area over it quickly, then it gets the orbiting problem that I had before. And it still has this behavior if you set the space override to replace, as you can see. I also tried disabling the collision layer on the gravity area, so it only has the mask, and I set the gravity area position in the physics process instead of on input, but it still has the issue. I even tried setting the continuous collision detection mode to cast shape, and to cast ray, just for good measure. But it still doesn't work. I also tried disabling the collision shape and setting the process mode to disabled. I realized the problem is the overlapping bodies are not being updated properly. It's moving in and out of the area in the same frame, so it thinks it's still there, but it's actually not. So I really did look for a better way to do this, but the only way that I can figure out is by adding a gravity toggle boolean, then in the process, if the gravity toggle is true, enable the first collision layer mask, otherwise disable. So this will essentially disable the collision layer every other frame, and this resets the overlapping bodies list. And I'll set the gravity toggle equal to not gravity toggle. And if anyone knows of a better way to get this to work, please let me know, because that's certainly not ideal, but it does have the desired effect where the items will drift away once they leave the gravity area. I did try disabling the collision mask in the process function and enabling it in the physics process, but that didn't work. It does have to go the whole frame enabled and then another whole frame disabled for it to register. And I tried toggling the space override, which didn't work either. Now back in the Derp star project, I'll open up the gravity beam and add the gravity toggle boolean set to true, and on ready I'll get the initial collision mask, so I can still set it through the editor and I don't have to manually set the numbers. So this is beam.collision mask, which returns an integer. Then in the process function, if the gravity toggle is true, set the beam collision mask equal to 0 to disable it. Otherwise, set the beam collision mask equal to the initial collision mask, and set the gravity toggle equal to not gravity toggle to invert it. I'm not sure if it is better to do this in the physics process, but I don't think it really makes a difference. And in the activate and deactivate functions, instead of calling setProcess, I'll set the process mode equal to process mode disabled in the deactivate function, which should stop the process and the physics process and also the physics collisions, although it doesn't seem to disable the gravity. Then in activate, I'll set it back to inherit so it can still be paused by the menu, and set the collision mask here, not the collision. So now you can sweep the bumpers with your gravity beam and they don't slingshot back towards you. It does still have an issue sometimes when you disable the beam while it's targeted. This is kind of hard to reproduce, but as you can see, the asteroid did come back. So in the deactivate, I'll set the collision mask to 0, and in activate, set the mask to the initial, and now it's completely solved the problem. So that's all for this episode of Derp Star, and I'll probably fix the shooting star rainbow shader next time. But thank you for watching and have a great day.